Hi, everybody. I'm so glad you could be here. My name is Kate, and on behalf of the Mining and Justice Solidarity Network, I want to welcome you here to this virtual space. We're so thrilled that you could be here tonight. MISN has been hard at work behind the scenes throughout the pandemic, but we haven't held a public-facing event or action since March 2020. And so hopefully we're not too rusty. Keep your fingers crossed for us. But just know that it's with the emotions of this many months of missing our community that we open this space tonight. I want to just give Karen a bit of a platform to talk a little bit about captioning, and then we'll get started.
Hi, everyone. Just quickly to mention that you'll see closed captioning at the bottom. It's automatic, so there's going to be some errors. We'll try to catch any of those errors in the chat.
Thanks, Karen. And while we're on the housekeeping note, we will be moderating the chat, and we'll work at addressing any disrespectful behavior if it hopefully doesn't come up, but if it does. And if anybody does end up having tech difficulties, feel free to send a direct message to Karen, who just spoke, who's named Karen Tech Support, and she'll do her best to help you solve that. And if you have any concerns about interpersonal dynamics in the session tonight, you can send a private message to Sydney. Do you want to wave, Sydney? And we would just generally want to ask folks to try to stay on topic in the chat, you know, in all of the community building that can happen in that parallel conversation. So I want to welcome you, as Sakura mentioned, to introduce yourself in the chat and let us know where you are right now. And if you know the Indigenous name of the territory that you're on, I encourage you to share that as well, or instead. Recognizing the fact that even our speakers tonight, let alone participants, are on many different territories, I want to take a second and acknowledge the land that I'm on in Toronto, or Tkaronto, which is a historic and contemporary gathering place of many Indigenous peoples, including the Anishinaabe, the Petun, the Huron-Wendat, the Haudenosaunee peoples, and which is now the treaty lands of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. Whenever I gather with others on this land, I feel really moved by the knowledge that this place that I'm standing on has been a place where communities have gathered for thousands of years to engage in commerce and trade and decision-making. And I feel moved by my responsibilities as a settler to uphold the sacred treaties governing this land, including the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement, and to fight against all forces that undermine Indigenous sovereignty in the present day. I also want to acknowledge that these past few months have been maybe more difficult than usual for many people living in the legacy and the present reality of colonial violence, both on this land and on colonized lands around the world, from the recent upsurge of violence on the occupied territories of Palestine, to the impacts of vaccine apartheid in colonized countries all over the world, to the militarized evictions of people living in encampments in Trinity Bellwoods here in Toronto, to the recent discovery of mass graves on lands that were not so long ago occupied by residential schools. I just want to extend some tenderness and some solidarity from my heart to yours if your heart is hurting today. Mining and justice is just one of many manifestations of the continuation of colonization and imperialism, and it's vital that we all take action from our personal spheres of influence to end these harms in ways that move beyond platitudes and empty words. And MISN is incredibly important to participating in that work. So, those of you who've been following MISN's work for years will know that this time of year is usually our busiest, so much so that we've given it the name shareholder season, pointing to the fact that these months between May and July are typically when mining companies that are headquartered here in Toronto hold their annual general meetings, or AGMs. And AGMs are gatherings that any publicly traded company in Canada is required by law to hold once a year in order to ensure that shareholders have up-to-date information about what's going on with their investment and a platform to ask questions, vote on important decisions, and then put forward resolutions. And these spaces of supposed transparency and accountability are owed to shareholders as a legal right in ways that are not equally granted to people in communities that are impacted by these corporations. And many people living on lands that are being threatened by Canadian extractivism are deprived of the basic opportunity to talk as a human being to another human being when it comes to massive projects that could or do have devastating consequences for them. And so it's been important for those of us living in Toronto or other major Canadian cities where mining companies are headquartered to take advantage of our location, to try to insert ourselves into these like really narrow opportunities for contact and to try to have an impact in some way using our privilege as English speaking, urban situated folks living in the global north. Since the pandemic, however, mining AGMs have largely gone online. And we witnessed firsthand a pretty disturbing trend of companies using the need to socially distance to close down channels for participation at these events. AGMs have largely become pre-recorded webinars with heavy moderation, high levels of censorship, and extremely limited opportunities when they were limited before to even just ask questions, let alone do anything disruptive. And so, you know, here we are in this situation in the middle of a global pandemic. And we wanted to take this time when we all of a sudden can't lean on one of our usual tricks to A, do a little Skillshare, and B, do a little collective thinking about the use of this tactic. So the objective of this event is not to convince you that AGM interventions are great and everybody should do them. In this moment where AGM interventions aren't really possible, we're hoping in this space to kind of like take a step back and like look at this thing together, strategically, tactically. What are the advantages and disadvantages of this kind of action? What are its strategic possibilities? When might it not be strategic? What are its limitations? And what are some ways that you might use this tactic in your organizing, whether it's against extractive companies or other kind of corporations? And we'll hear lots of stories tonight. This is first and foremost a night for storytelling. From hearing from folks who are involved with MISN or our dear, dear allies who have engaged in different kinds of AGM interventions in the past. And there will be opportunities for you to ask questions, and there will be opportunities for you to talk to each other and brainstorm a little bit how to kind of translate some of what you're learning or what you're feeling maybe inspired by into thinking about your own life and your own spheres of activism and living. So that first opportunity is now. We're gonna wanted to have this be a bit of a community focused event and give you a bit of an opportunity to encounter each other. I know a lot of these webinars tend to be like a little lean back and listen, but I miss you. We miss each other and we want to make sure that we have the chance to connect. So we're going to send you all into breakout rooms for 10 minutes just to give you the chance to introduce yourself to each other. Well, hopefully everybody had the chance to meet somebody new. We'll be sending you back into breakout rooms after the storytelling is over, so you have the chance to debrief and chat a little bit in a brainstorming space. But we're going to move into the storytelling part of the evening. The stories that we're going to share with you tonight come from a range of different folks who are connected to MISN in some way, either as members or as friends. And we've kind of tried to curate like a range of different kinds of interventions. Some of these interventions are about kind of following the rules of the AGM space to a T as a way of kind of meeting a goal. Some of the stories we're going to tell tonight are about deeply and profoundly breaking the rules and everything in between, because there are a lot of different ways that we can make use of these kinds of spaces for the purposes of justice and Indigenous sovereignty and environmental justice. So we hope that the stories that you hear tonight provide some inspiration and some food for thought. And so just to give a little bit of framing, if you find that you have a question come up for you as you're listening to folks tell stories, if it is a simple question, feel free to drop it in the chat and maybe one of the folks speaking might be able to answer. If it's a more complex question, we'll have time after the storytelling and then after the breakout room that happens after to answer any questions if they require a little bit more complexity or verbal explanation. So write them down so you don't forget. We super want to hear your questions, and we'll definitely get to them later. So, okay, storytellers, are you ready? We're going to do this rapid fire styles. Okay, wonderful. First up, we're going to hear from the wonderful Rachel Small, who is a longtime MISN organizer. Go ahead, Rachel.
Thank you. I'm just going to try to share my screen here. Can y'all see that? Great. So I just have a few minutes, so I'm not going to give much intro, but I wanted to share some stories about the ways that we have directly involved impacted communities. And by that, I mean like communities at mine sites where the mining injustice is directly happening in the annual general meetings of companies that they are already resisting every day, where the proposed or ongoing or current or closing mine is, but ways that we could collaborate to bring either their stories to directly to the CEOs, the shareholders and meetings there, or in this case, I really want to focus on when we were actually able to help them come physically and be face to face with, frankly, the corporate criminals who are destroying their homes, stealing their lands, et cetera, et cetera. So I want to talk about Hudbay because it's a company that we've resisted for many years at a lot of shareholder meetings, and different ways that we've helped bring different communities resisting Hudbay who speak different languages all over the world together, especially at shareholder meetings. So in 2014, after many years of working in solidarity with communities in Guatemala who were impacted by the mine formerly owned by Hudbay, we ended up being able to connect with folks from the Matthias Kalom Cree Nation in near Pakatawagan in northern Manitoba, who were resisting many different aspects of Hudbay's long-term mining in the region, and support them in protesting with us at Hudbay's annual general meeting. Here's a photo of Chief Arlen Dumas, of the drumming and the speeches that were able to happen outside of the AGM on that day, directly contradicting what Hudbay was saying both in Canada and in Guatemala about how amazing they were at engaging and working with Indigenous communities. Here was the Indigenous community at one of their longest held mines in northern Manitoba, directly confronting them, saying, that's not the truth. I'm the chief of this community, and what you're saying is a lie, and we don't stand for it. We also blew up 300 helium balloons that same morning and snuck them into the lobby of that same building where the meeting was happening upstairs. It's hard to see from the angle because you could only see the full story from going all the way around, but it said Hudbay Minerals, corporate criminals. It looks small here, but this is a ginormous banner, 300 balloons stuck in the lobby of their building, so that everyone coming in or leaving the AGM or coming or leaving that corporate tower in general were confronted with this protest and with what was happening. So this is the sneaky thing sort of that we did inside. And at the same time, there was this really powerful protest outside. The next year, we were able to support Angelica Choc on the left, Herman Chub, and Rosa Elvira, who were members of Indigenous Mayan Kekchi communities in El Estor, Guatemala, that I mentioned earlier, victims of just horrific repression carried out by and for Hudbay Minerals. I can't get into sort of the stories now because it's a longer story to tell, but they are also the plaintiffs in the historic and precedent-setting lawsuits against Hudbay Minerals in Canada. Historic because it's the first time Canadian mining company has actually been brought to court for crimes committed overseas. What I do want to tell you is that through our shares that we owned and assigning them as proxy to these folks, they were able to go inside the shareholder meeting. And I just want to read a quote from what Angelica said inside. Hudbay has done nothing to accept responsibility for what happened at and near its mine, nor to make amends for the harm suffered by my family, by Rosa and the other women, by Herman and his family. Instead, Hudbay hides behind its lawyers and propaganda statements. Hudbay has said Rosa is lying about being raped. Hudbay has said that Herman fabricated a story about how he was shot. Hudbay says I threatened witnesses to force them to provide false testimony. We are here in person to tell you our truth as we lived it. So if you can just imagine what a powerful moment for everyone that they face to face with the CEO, with the shareholders, with the company Hudbay, said those words to them, knowing very well what Hudbay was saying in the courtroom, what Hudbay was saying about them. And meanwhile, so they were inside in this really like incredibly toxic space. It's hard to sort of explain if you've never been in one of these meetings where, you know, they're just sort of bragging about how amazing they are. So they got up and they courageously spoke there. And then they came outside where we had a huge protest to greet them. And what was really interesting was that we were also able to connect, this is at the same protest outside, with the International Association of Machinists and Aerospace Workers, IAM union, who were currently on strike at Hudbay's Flin Flon Snow Lake mine in Northern Canada. And so this is David Ritchie, the VP of the union, who was speaking outside the AGM, again, just to sort of connect these different communities from different parts of the world at the place where Hudbay is trying to convince investors that they should invest more in their mine, where they're trying to raise capital, where they're trying to basically perform at this AGM. The final thing I'll say maybe is that throughout those 2 years and the subsequent years, we were ultimately able to connect and share statements, and in some cases bring in person people from communities located at 100% of Hudbay's mines across the Americas. So that includes, like I mentioned, the Matthias-Clone Cree Nation, Northern Manitoba, the Ayllu in Uchucarco, Peru, the movement against Hudbay's Rosemont mine in Arizona, and then of course the folks from Guatemala as well. So just a really powerful way that folks were able to be directly confronting this company through their shareholder meetings. And because we had shares and we assigned them to those people, they tried to not let them in, but ultimately they had a legal right to be there. And so it was a tool that we were able to use in that way. I think I'm over time, so I will stop there. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Rachel. Next up, we're going to hear from Catherine Anderson, who is the founder of the Maritimes Guatemala Breaking the Silence Solidarity Network and has been involved in solidarity with mining resistance communities in Guatemala since 2004. Catherine is also active in a group called SONS, or Sustainable Northern Nova Scotia, which seeks to ban gold mining in watersheds in northern Nova Scotia and the Cobequid Mountain region. Hey, Catherine.
Hi, I'm just going to try and talk a little bit about some of the challenges for those of us who do go to resolution to annual meetings such as Gold Court, and some of the challenges that are there and that we've found over the years. And I'm going to try and finish by saying, even though we did the kind of traditional resolution intervention fitting to a T, we never accepted to just fit to a T inside, never mind the outside work that other people will talk about. But I do want to say that I think my experience, and many of us who went to the first Gold Corps annual meetings, we were the first group that challenged Canadian companies, ultimately like Hudbay and others, was with Gold Corps, was the first Canadian company that imposed its will on Indigenous communities in Guatemala. And I would say I'd start with our naivete. I thought that by bringing a resolution to an annual meeting, we'd actually might get 50% of the voters. I had no idea that it's considered a victory when you get 10%. Now there's the exception, ExxonMobil, this magnificent victory a month ago, but that's with a worldwide organization and around a huge movement. Mining justice is a much harder movement. So that's the first thing that I would say. And I would also say that to consider doing actual shareholder resolutions is a huge amount of work, and it takes a huge amount of planning ahead of time, months and months ahead of time. You have to buy you can't buy those shares right away. I was a shareholder. I've gotten rid of them since, but you have to buy them well ahead of time. And then you have to find out how many shares. And Gold Corps didn't ask for, I had 10 shares and I was able to speak, but lots of companies don't. You have to own thousands of shares to even have the right to speak. So the kind of research is really, really important. And then and you have to find out all the rules you never knew. Even though we were in the end over a few years, because we did this from 2009 to 2012, we thought we knew the rules. We just about missed it because we thought that you had to be 60 days before the date of the next annual meeting when you have to be 60 days before a year from the annual meeting the year before. And all of this depends on provincial laws, federal laws, depending on where your company is, how it's registered. So plenty of work. And then there's the question of money if you want to bring your partners. And certainly I would say that that has been one of the most powerful experiences, as Rachel just gave excellent examples. And in that we were able also to bring over the years people from communities affected by Gold Corp, who the companies really did not want to ever speak in public. And they did get coverage in the media that would not happen, mainstream media, and also media that shareholders actually can read. Northern Miner, for example, important media for impacting, and that sometimes some journalists are actually looking for stories, because just reporting on a 10-minute, by the way, 10-minute annual meeting, it's after the 10 minutes that you get to ask your questions and make your statements. Rarely do you get any time to speak during the 10 minutes when they actually do the legal aspect of the meeting.
Just
and
one minute.
1 minute?
Thanks.
Okay, well, I think I will just say then that it's worth doing if you think that you can get your voices heard in that way, that you might not get heard. Otherwise, you can bring people together from across the country, north and south. We brought wonderful women. We didn't bring them. They came for other reasons, and we linked up together women struggling with Gold Corp, Indigenous women in northern BC, with folks from Chile, from Honduras, from Guatemala, from Argentina, all affected by Gold Corp. And the other thing that I want to say is you have to be bold. This is where the fitting into a T. The vice president of Gold Corp tried to stop one of our activists coming into the meeting. And I said I would raise hell on the floor if he did that. He backed down right away. And similarly, they sent out our resolution to the voters, to the investors, to the shareholders, without the whereases, which are any resolution. If any of you have been to any kind of meeting, you know the whereases are fundamental. So they said, well, you only have 2 minutes to speak. I said, I am not speaking for 2 minutes. I'm speaking for 5 minutes so that we can read the resolution out with the whereases. So even when you're doing the pretty traditional shareholder resolution thing, I think people have to be prepared to be bold. Is my time up? Okay.
Thank you so much, Catherine. Thanks for that correction, Merle, without the warehouses.
Whereases, did I say warehouses?
No, the captioning was not understood.
Oh, okay.
Thank you so much. I think I'm next, actually. I'm so grateful that Rachel and Catherine got us started with like some examples of some like bold, complicated, complicated in a good way, interventions at annual general meetings. If you're sitting here though, I'm not sure what issues folks are organizing around in this room. Maybe you're newer to organizing, or you just maybe just like want to have the experience of going to an annual general meeting for the first time before like organizing something big and disruptive. And so I'm going to spend a little bit of time just talking about the power of a well-placed question in an annual general meeting as one example of something that you can do. So I want to talk about an experience that I had when I went to the annual general meeting of a company called Noront Resources in 2019. Noront is the company that is, for those of you who've been following this like decade-long saga about the Ring of Fire, the so-called Ring of Fire in Northern Ontario, they're the company that is kind of like leading the charge in developing this deposit of chromite that they say will be like a generational opportunity, but that is, has very, very complex issues in kind of pitting Indigenous communities against each other. And so this was very early in my experience organizing around the Ring of Fire. I still was kind of figuring out the issues, understanding the complexities. And so I decided to go to the Neuron AGM just to kind of familiarize myself a little bit with how this company talks. So this was in 2019, and I realized, or I discovered in just sitting there listening to the CEO Alan Coots talk, that this company was really good at talking the talk of Indigenous consultation, right? They'd learned all the language. They were just, it was this performance of Indigenous consent. And part of that was that they used the space of the annual general meeting to publicly announce a new memorandum of understanding that they had signed with one First Nation who was in support of this project, very conveniently leaving out the fact that there was active opposition to the project from Niskandiga First Nation. I'm just not mentioning that whatsoever. And so, yeah, they were really good at talking the talk of respecting Indigenous sovereignty. And if I didn't know their track record, and likely many shareholders present didn't, I would have probably been convinced by it, and without the presence of some dissent or disagreement. So the question that I asked was just, what are your plans for responding to First Nations who continue to oppose the Eagle's Nest project? Right, it was just a simple question. I could have just been any person curious and wanting to know. And what that one question did was twofold. One is that it gave shareholders information that was being conveniently left out of their song and dance, right? That there is active opposition to this mine. There are some First Nations that are in support, but that it's complicated, right? There's complexity at play. And the other thing that asking that question did for the folks who are in the coalition that MISN is a part of organizing around the Ring of Fire is that we gained some important early information about part of Neuron's strategy. They're like propaganda strategy, and their strategy for advancing their project, which is that starting that year, they would start kind of downloading responsibility for building an ethical relationship with Indigenous communities down onto these two First Nations that would be taking over from Neuron and acting as proponents in the environmental assessment projects for the two roads that needed to be built in order for the mine to happen. And so when I asked that question, Alan Coots said, essentially like, well, it's up, I don't know, that's up to the proponents, right? That's up to the First Nations who were kind of taking over the environmental assessment about the two roads that would be built straight to the mine, which it sounds like supporting their self-determination, but is actually an abdication of responsibility. So being inside that space was really useful, just to be like, oh, I see, this is the strategy that they're using. This is how they're kind of downloading and offloading their responsibility. And so we need to know this so that we can figure out how to respond, because we know now that they're going to be really, really good at tricking people in the Canadian public into thinking that they're actually doing a good job when they're really, really participating in an age-old pattern of divide and rule between First Nations that are all having different perspectives on the question of like whether this mining project is going to serve their community in the way that it's being promised. And that's me. Next up, we have Merle Davis, who's a MISN organizer currently based on Dakota and Anishinaabe territory.
Hi, everyone. I'm just going to share the Google Doc that I'm reading out of in the chat in case anyone wants to read along. Sorry, I'm going to just time myself. So I'm Merle, long-term MISN organizer. I've been organizing with MISN since 2013. And since I have been involved, my major focus has been on Toronto as the belly of the beast. So for me, solidarity is about taking responsibility for the ways in which my life has been made possible through the mining industry and fighting capitalism and colonialism in the place I grew up and have made a life. So though I'm currently based in Minneapolis, which is also the belly of a different kind of beast, so I'm currently based in Minneapolis, but focused on Toronto. Toronto is not always understood as a colonial frontline, but I think it can be understood that way. And many MISN actions have attempted to draw attention to that dynamic. Our actions around the Prospectors and Developers Association of Canada's annual conference, or PDAC, have frequently focused on putting the industry on the radar for Torontonians. So today I'm going to talk about something a little different from attending AGMs, the Inside PDAC action MISN did in 2020. We've also disrupted some AGMs, and maybe we can talk about that more later, but I just figured this was a fun one to chat about today that would give people a sense of some different things MISN does. So during the keynote speech at PDAC 2020, MISN members disrupted by playing the sounds of jackhammers in order to highlight our critiques of the free entry system. We go to PDAC for many different reasons: information gathering, understanding industry trends, but my favorite moments are always intervening in and disrupting the show they put on. It's a very self-congratulatory space, and reminding mining executives that they cannot escape the critiques and resistance of communities can feel really empowering. After attending PDAC virtually this year, where critique was made nearly impossible, I've reflected a lot more on the role of critique, of disruption, and the importance of it. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about the strategy behind it, about free entry laws that we were critiquing, and the keynote speech itself. In this process, I'm going to quote some deeply colonial language that will possibly be upsetting to some people. So I just want to give you a heads up about that. And if you need to leave for a moment, my thing is only going to be about 2.5 more minutes. So the 2020 keynote was on the importance of exploration geology. The mining industry is divided such that companies who operate mines and those who prospect, called juniors, are usually different. These junior explorers operate through a number of supports, including friendly legal frameworks, such as the free entry system. So in the press release for this action, we wrote, "Free entry gives mineral prospectors the exclusive right to look for minerals wherever they stake a claim, as long as they have the proper permits and licenses, have submitted an exploration plan, and as long as that land fits within certain criteria. The free entry system has its history in British law and was exported to many places that Britain colonized, including Canada. The logic of this law is based in terra nullius, the idea that any land not being put to use productive to capital is empty and should be put to productive use. Productive. The assumption here is that exploration is not a disturbing or damaging event, which it very often is, causing shakes and burrowing deep into the ground. Juniors often rely on the idea that exploration is in a somewhat gray area when it comes to consultation. So communities may learn a stake has been claimed through the disruption that exploration causes. Juniors do actually need to tell potentially impacted people about exploration, but they do not need to necessarily seek permission. And how potentially impacted people are defined is often quite narrow. So during the keynote, we played the sounds of drilling over Barrick Gold CEO Mark Bristow's keynote address to bring the impacts communities face in some small ways into these corporate spaces that are so often devoid of any meaningful critique. During the keynote speech, we sat through like a few minutes of, as we waited to turn our Bluetooth speakers on, Mark Bristow said, "If you are hunting elephants, you have to venture into elephant country. Exploration needs to get off the reservation," yeah, he actually said those words, "and back to its pioneering roots." I'm going to skip past a little bit so I keep in time. So we didn't start playing the sounds of drills thinking we could reach PDAC attendees. Our hope, rather, was to give them a small sense of what it feels like when someone comes in without permission and without respect for the way you have related to or set up a space. I personally felt really nervous turning the speaker on because politeness feels so deeply ingrained in me. I think probably something a lot of white settler Canadians can relate to. And sometimes that politeness can serve me in gaining access to spaces to take notes or gather information. But in this moment, I wanted them just briefly to viscerally understand the impacts they have on others. So I tapped into anger, and it felt really powerful to express that feeling in their space, to take away their self-congratulatory facade for a moment. I highly recommend it.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Merle. Next up, we're going to hear from Sydney Lang, who's a member of MISN as well.
Hi, everyone. I'm just going to set up my timer. So I'm going to speak today briefly about the ways that MISN in the past has attended AGMs as a way of gathering information. And I'm going to use the OceanaGold AGM in 2016 as an example. So just for some context, OceanaGold is an Australian-Canadian mining company, and they brought an international investment arbitration case against El Salvador for $250 million in 2009. And they claim that El Salvador had unfairly refused to grant it a concession to proceed with one of its mining projects. El Salvadorians were clear that they didn't want mining to proceed in the country, and MISN was standing in solidarity with many local communities who were advocating for that. And around that time, we were also waiting for the center's decision on the case. The AGM was held on June 9 at the Fairmont Royal York in downtown Toronto, and we used a few different tactics at this AGM. So first, we had a protest or a rally outside, and we have a video, so I'll share that in the chat right after. Rachel, who spoke earlier, also had read a statement inside the AGM, and she was a shareholder, so she was able to get in that way. And then I was also attending to record and take notes at the AGM as a guest. So for most AGMs, you're allowed to enter, or oftentimes you're allowed to enter as a guest. Although, of course, they have the discretion to decide whether or not you're allowed to attend. So we decided that I would try to blend in and gather as much information as I could at the AGM by kind of going undercover. And this was because I was kind of a new MISN member at the time. So it was likely that the company or private security wouldn't recognize my name, or if they did Google my name, that it wouldn't show up that I was a member of MISN or another activist group. And also because I was able to kind of dress and look like I belonged in that space. So I'd worked in offices and I had a lot of dress clothes. I didn't have like a lot of visible tattoos, which is something that seems to like trigger people in those spaces. And I'm a white woman. So yeah, and I prepared a backstory before going in, which was that I was a law student who was really interested in the industry, and all of that seemed to be enough to let me in when they kind of questioned why I was attending that day. So when we're going to gather information at an AGM, sometimes we might have a specific, like some specific pieces of information that we're looking for if there's like a specific project that's happening, but usually we're just trying to go in and see what the company is saying to its shareholders about its own operations. And usually we'll do this, like record this by taking notes in a notepad or on a phone, or also doing an audio recording on a phone. And this information is useful because it tells us, again, what the company is telling its shareholders. And it can sometimes be informative, but usually it just gives us a statement from the company that we can then counter on social media or in other insider spaces. And often we can counter it with testimony from the impacted community about what's actually happening on the ground. And something I learned from this AGM is that it's often the conversations and remarks that happen in between the planned speeches at the AGM, like the official agenda items. Those in between comments can be particularly insightful and helpful. So just as an example, at the OceanaGold AGM, we could clearly hear the rally outside, which is awesome because it means that it was successful. It was clearly disrupting this AGM, and it was a conversation starter too. So attendees couldn't not address this noise that they were hearing. And after the AGM, a bunch of people were looking at the window, and I started talking with one of the executives and explained that I was like interested in the industry and curious about like, why are these protests happening? I didn't think there'd be opposition to mining, what the heck? And he replied that most of the protesters don't even know what they're talking about. And he said that most of them couldn't even point out El Salvador on a map. And this comment kind of gave us insight into how our remarks and presence were being perceived by the company. Although obviously, like, we weren't surprised by these comments, but it was clear that the company's approach was to attack our intellect and to frame the stories that we were recounting about their operations as nonsense. And like that could potentially be able to inform our strategy going forward, but it also kind of gave us the opportunity to shame the company for that comment. So it was obviously really rude and offensive. And we could post that on social media and say, hey, OceanaGold, is that what you really think about the people who are standing in solidarity with the local communities that you're supposedly working with? So yeah, and then just as a quick reflection on that, I think that blending in and kind of doing the undercover thing in these spaces can be really strategic and useful in terms of gaining access to certain conversations and spaces. But we've also been reflecting on the fact that sometimes it's good for the company to know that there are people who aren't on the inside, who are listening, who are paying attention to what they're doing and are holding them accountable outside of those spaces too. So So yeah, that's just one example of how we've used AGMs to gather information.
Thanks, Sydney. So we have somebody else scheduled to speak right now. I don't see Susanna here. I just want to do one last double check. So I think instead we're going to show a video of an intervention that MISN did a couple of years ago, not at an AGM, but at the Prospectors and Developers Association of Canada convention, which not, has sessions, as Merle was describing earlier, but also has these like this huge convention floor where you can just walk up to the booths of different companies and talk to somebody. And so we wanted to show this video because it kind of illustrates one way that AGM interventions can be helpful, which is that if you're careful, it can create a little accountability mechanism that might not otherwise exist. So one really common way that mining companies deflect accountability is by saying like, well, we haven't heard of that, this critique that you're making, this opposition, like we've only heard support for our project. And so there's one really easy way of mitigating that, which is to film yourself telling them that, and then they can't say that they didn't know that anymore. So the video is about a minute and a half long. This is me in my best winter coat talking to some representatives of a company called Cornerstone Resources, which was encroaching on a community in Ecuador that we've been working in collaboration with. And after we made this video, it went viral throughout Ecuador. It also is it never will cease to make me laugh because the member of MISN who filmed this accidentally left a filter on. And so not only was the confrontation powerful, also everybody's wearing sleepy time hats in the video. So I hope you enjoy.
From 30 communities in Ecuador. Are you ready? I'm not sure if you received the letter that was sent to you earlier in January, but we have some copies for you here. On behalf of 30 communities in Ecuador who all have something to say, which is no. No to mining on their lands, no to metal mining in general, no to Cornerstone specifically because of the blatant disrespect that has been shown to the community. We have photographs here of many different protests that have happened at all corners of Ecuador, of community members saying they don't want you on their lands. And we delivered a letter to you earlier in January saying just the same with the support of many other allies. And so the question that we have for you is, what's your response? Why have you not responded to these communities saying no? Nothing to say?
No, nothing to say.
Do you plan on responding at all to these communities who are saying they don't want you on their territories?
No comment right now. Thank you.
Well,
Thanks for your
that says a lot.
Thank you, lady.
Out, Cornerstone, out! Yeah, well, they have something to say to you.
Out, Cornerstone, out! Out, Cornerstone, out! Out, Cornerstone, out! Out, Cornerstone, out!
All right, let's go.
All right. So we have one last storyteller and then send you all the way to brainstorm and talk a little bit about what's on your mind right now after hearing all these stories. Last but not least, we have the wonderful Sakura Saunders, one of the founding members of the Mining and Justice Solidarity Network and all around badass activist. Thanks for rounding us out, Saku.
Thanks for having me. I'm just getting rid of my baby so I can do this intervention. So I have been protesting AGMs for as long as I have been in Canada, if not longer, because my first time ever in Toronto was for a Barrick Gold AGM. So about 13 years. And I actually reached out to Catherine Coumans before preparing my remarks today, just because it's definitely always been a team effort. Catherine with Mining Watch Canada takes the inside and I take the outside with the big protest and stuff. And so the first thing that I wanted to mention is just that, it's a great convergence point. And I'm going to share, I'm going to try to share my screen real quick with you guys. Oops. Share screen, there we go. And so, this is just a picture of some youth from the student school, a high school, an alternative high school in Toronto. And so, it's a convergence point. So it's a great excuse to get people together. The focus is on the company itself. And not only are you able to reach out and give opportunities to share space and collaborate with allies like these students at the student school. They're kind of like my high school affinity group. But also it's a convergence point, as Catherine mentioned, Catherine Kumans, that all the impacted communities get to come together and share stories, and it's really powerful and validating to know that Barrick is has a host of similar reasons, but is treating communities badly kind of across the board, and then they can go back and tell their community about what's happening with Barrick and other communities. It's a convergence point. It's for artwork as well. So here's Sergio Campuzano. He was the president of the Dieguito Huascalatinos, or is the president of the Dieguito Huascalatinos indigenous and agricultural community, next to a giant deck of cards, a house of cards, talking about all the different issues that Barrick is facing at their many different mines, from Papua New Guinea and Tanzania to Chile and Argentina to Dominican Republic and Peru, to the United States and Canada. So another wonderful thing that I've experienced in using this annual general meeting as a focal point is, of course, the dialogue, the very public dialogue that it creates with the companies themselves. And so this was in 2010. It was the front page of the business section in the Toronto Star. And Peter Monk basically went on this very long tirade about how great he was for communities. I mean, listening to it, you'd have thought that Barrick Gold was a development NGO and not a mining company, because they just really benefited the communities so much. And then having the communities there themselves to completely counter the messaging of what he was saying, it created this conflict. And of course, journalists love conflict. And as much as you can create a theater out of the AGM itself, it's advantageous in terms of getting media attention. And another thing about the attention that it brings, not only of the media, but it also helps create a kind of alternative narrative with policymakers and everything else. And of course, when you're bringing these communities from all these different places to Canada, where these companies are based, you're not just there for the AGM ever. You are there to talk to pension funds and politicians and other allies and professors and students, so that the activism can continue throughout the year, but also have that personal connection. And something that Catherine mentioned that I agree with, I was really happy to hear her mention it. I have 30 seconds left. Was how empowering it is for the communities themselves to speak truth to power, and how important it is for them to have that support outside the AGM as well, in terms of feeling that support. And so this is a really beautiful moment out of a AGM where they actually weren't allowed to speak, though they did get a lot of media attention and got their story out there, almost because in some ways because they weren't allowed to speak. But we took up the entire street. This is Front Street. And, everyone was so upset when they heard that Barrick wouldn't let them take the mic, that they, took the entire street of Front Street. We had a marching band with us, and we took up space. And I don't know, I guess you can kind of see it on their faces, especially everyone there, that this was an empowering experience to know that people stood with them, and that these mining abuses were not acceptable anywhere. So I need to stop sharing my screen now. There we go. Is my screen not shared anymore?
Yeah, you're all good.
Okay, but was it shared earlier?
Yes.
Okay, good. Just making sure.
You did a good job. All right. Thank you so much to all of our storytellers tonight. So hopefully you have some thoughts on your mind. We're going to send you straight back into different breakout groups, so that you can start to kind of articulate and say out loud some of the things that you're thinking about right now. We're going to give you about 7 minutes to do that because we are slowly running out of time. Okay, so before we take your questions, we want to just immediately answer 2 major questions, like simple questions, obvious questions that you might have. One being, how the heck do I buy a share so I can go to a shareholder meeting? And the other being, how do I find out when a shareholder meeting is, or where it is, or how do I physically, geographically get there? And so we're going to answer those questions really quick and then take anything else that you have. Karen, are you ready to demo? Okay, so Karen's going to show you how to find out where and when a publicly traded company shareholder meeting is happening.
Sorry, I just closed what I needed to have open. I'm almost there. There we go. Can folks see my screen? Someone say yay. So I'm going to do this quick and dirty. The SADAR is this awesome online tool that's actually for investors to check up on companies, and companies who are publicly listed in Canada are supposed to be they're supposed to file all of their financial information, other information like environmental impact assessments, upcoming meetings, any kind of information that might be useful for investors to know in terms of risk, the risk in their investment. And we, however, in MISN like to use it as a way of, we use it for a bunch of different things, but for the purposes of this workshop, we like to use it for finding out when AGMs actually take place. So I'm going to show you very quickly. We click on whichever your preferred language is. You go up here to something called issuer profiles, which is really just the companies that post and file their information, which is a responsibility that they have to carry out. Then you get this cool letter alphabetically, and I am going to choose. I'm going to choose a company called Newmont Gold, which used to be called Goldcorp, which is the one that a few people have spoken to today, and give you this view, which is just sort of the general information, and then you click on view this company's documents. And it's great. So it gives you a list of a lot of documents, which are, some of them are confusing. There's a lot of information that you don't have to worry about. News releases are very useful because you can find out, what they're trying to admit to their shareholders, or what kind of information they're trying to share. So information about recent takeovers, or look, we just found a big pot of gold in the middle of this territory. And so it's useful to kind of be on top of that and share that information with impacted communities and whatnot. So I'm going to click down below, which is something called notice of meeting. And they call it notice of meeting. Sometimes they'll say shareholder. Sometimes it'll also be in the news release. But in this case, you click on the document that you want to access, and they want to make sure that you're a human. So you do this human-y thing by filling in the letters. And then, just trying to see if I can make this bigger here.
Karen, did it open up a pop-up window?
Oh, I did. Yes.
We can only see the original window.
Oh, okay. Well, basically, it's a screen that shows you the actual information around the shareholders meeting. So I think you should be able to see that now. So in this case, they had posted it to SEDAR on March 12th, and it's for the shareholder meeting that's happening on April 28th. So they did actually give a bit of time. Sometimes the leeway or the advance notice isn't as long. So as MISN, we try to check out starting in March of each year to see when the shareholders are. For mining companies, they're generally in between March and June. So depending on what kind of sector you're looking at, there might be a good time for you to be checking online or not. So okay, I will leave it at that.
Thanks, Karen. Okay, so Rachel is not going to teach you how to buy a share. Rachel is going to teach you what are some ingredients that she possesses that led to her being MISN's shareholder, with the hopes that that information might be useful to you too.
Yeah, really would encourage everyone to do what Karen suggested and check out SEDAR. It's got to be like the website that looks like that is from the 80s, that is most commonly updated. Like companies are forced to put all their stuff there, but they haven't obviously updated the basic format of the website in 3 decades. But don't get put off by how weird that website looks like. Everything is there. So first things first, I want to address something that Kate said, but also as a common misconception. Like groups can't own shares. Shares have to be owned by a person. I mean, there's other like complicated things on the scale of how corporations can own each other and so forth. But in terms of like shareholders of the type that we're talking about, it's got to be in a person's name. So when we say MISN has shares in blah, blah, blah companies, that actually means that a few different MISN members have personally under their name bought a share in that company. Obviously can be reimbursed by the group or so forth. So most people invest through a broker. I think there are ways to like actually individually buy shares, but it's complicated and it's expensive, and it's probably not worth it if you're talking about buying shares just for the purpose of like shareholder activism. Whether you own 1 share or like, I don't know, 10,000 shares, you're a shareholder and you have the rights that we've been sort of talking about using in this meeting, like attending a meeting, and in theory, maybe asking a question or at least getting the shareholder documents. So most people invest through a broker. This can be like an actual person, and this used to be the only way that people could have shares, or it can be through an online brokerage. So every big bank in Canada like does have its own brokerage arm, but usually if you just kind of go through your bank, it I think costs like $10 per transaction, which can feel extremely ridiculous when a lot of the shares you're buying are like 5 cents, and then you pay $10 each for each one. But that's one way to do it. So you can literally just go to your bank and say, I'd like to open a trading account. You would open a share trading account and you would put some money into it, and then you would buy the shares that you want to buy. Most people, I think, go through a different type of broker. There are online brokerages now, which I think is probably the cheapest way to do it, but I can't advocate for them because I haven't used them. But things like Wealthsimple or Questrade are like ways that individual people can buy shares and like have different types of discounts. Things to know, if you go through a broker, whether that's a bank, whether that's an online broker, etc., you're not a registered shareholder, you're a beneficial shareholder or a non-registered shareholder. This is extremely important when you like look into what are the rights of shareholders and what access do you have to AGMs. But either way, you are a shareholder and you have access to attend. If you are a non-registered shareholder in Canada, there are 2 different types. It's very important that you not be one who is refusing to disclose your name to the company if you want to be able to do things like attend AGMs. And I won't go into all the details of that, but a really important thing to know is if you're trying to buy a share in a company in order to actively participate as a shareholder, you're doing something that is extremely weird within the financial system. It's not at all what it's set up to do. So while it's not actually difficult to purchase shares by setting up a trading account or going through a broker, you will need to every step of the way double check. I would like my name to be registered as a shareholder. I would like the materials to be mailed to my house. As you can imagine, the average investor might go through a portfolio, might have investments in like 100 different companies, and they don't want the like mountains of mail that I receive in the mail every shareholder season from these companies. So you're explicitly doing something different that you're legally entitled to do, but you'll have to be clear about that. The reason that I'm the person through MISN who's been buying shares is because I ended up realizing that my dad has had like a broker at his bank who he's been investing with for, I don't know, 4 decades. And like has this long relationship with this person, and that person does the investments for my dad. And it ended up being that we could just ask this person like, hey, can you be a broker for my daughter and just invest a little bit of money for her? And he said, no problem. They're trying to be loyal to their customers. And that meant that I could actually do these trades for free. I'm still paying for the shares, but I'm not paying that pesky like $10 fee every time I buy or sell. This is obviously not available to everyone. Like, I'm very lucky that I have a parent who has some money that is being invested, but also like it's also not the most uncommon thing. Like a lot of people do have investment, especially if they have like a retirement savings fund or something like that. And it's something to try to access to. And it's really fun to kind of usurp these systems in these ways. And the first time I tried to set it up, the person thought I was like not making sense, saying that I just wanted to buy one share in this company and I want the materials mailed to me and I want all these various shareholder rights. But now they get it. And now pretty much once a month I order a few new shares. They range in price from about 1 cent to, I think my most expensive mining share is $21. So the individual shares are not that expensive. And for that 1 cent that I have in, I think it's KWG Resources, I have the full rights of a shareholder. So there's a lot more details, and I'd be happy to like answer questions or discuss individually, or you could email MISN if you want sort of more the details of how to do it. But that's the basic gist.
That's awesome. Thank you.
Rachel, could I just add to that, though? If you want to submit a resolution, lots of companies require you to own quite a few.
Yeah, that's useful. So we don't have a ton of time left, but if anybody does have questions, strategy, about tactics, about the logistics or details, feel free to throw your hand up using the Zoom function or just unmute yourself.
I just wanted to share a resource, which is called targeted.ca, and any any email account that's for an actual website and not like a Gmail or Hotmail, but like, for example, like info at mininginjustice.org would work. Any email like that entitles you to like a trial account for a couple of weeks. And it is such a great website for finding out where the pension funds are invested. You can look at a company itself, and then it'll show you all of the top investors. So, BlackRock's always way up there. But, you can find out if your bank is there, or your mutual fund, or your pension fund. And, that could lead to some, a connection. Lots of times pension funds are not willing to divest because they have this fiduciary obligation. But like Catherine was saying, you do need a significant amount of shares to put forward resolutions, and they'd love to do that kind of stuff. They want the pension funds would rather put forward a resolution than divest from a company.
Thank you. Are there any questions? Yeah, Diana.
I was a bit late, so I'm not sure if this was spoken about, but I caught the part where all of you were mentioning about going to AGMs and buying shares. Now, is one of the goals to get as many of us to buy shares, right? Or Rachel, you were mentioning you just buy one share, right? And do any of you buy enough so you can do resolutions? Like, I don't know if this was answered or spoken about before, so my apologies.
I think it depends on what your goal is and what kind of intervention you're trying to do. So if you want to go the shareholder resolution route, then you'll want to get the number of shares that you need in order to do that. In MISN's activism, we tend to try to by as few, like wanting to give as little money as possible to the company. And so just trying to make sure that we have enough to be able to do the thing that we're trying to do, whether it's to ask a question or engage in some sort of intervention. So, but yeah, it really just kind of depends on what you're trying to accomplish. Yeah, Rachel.
Yeah, what I was going to say is kind of interesting is like from my perspective, the types of interventions MISN does, like there's no reason for me to have more than one share. However, sometimes we have wanted a few different people to each have one share because that each one is a shareholder and can either go in the meeting, or more commonly, I'll assign there's a system called proxy. Like I can assign someone to be my proxy, which means to attend the meeting and vote instead of me. So I'm a shareholder. I have the right to vote. Oh, I can't go out in person, and I don't want to vote like the normal way. So I would like someone to attend in my place, and you can assign anyone to do so. So that's how we've brought in like impacted community members and other people to attend these meetings. So if only one person has the shares, whether I have 1 or 10 or whatever, I can still only assign one person to attend. So like in some companies where we know we want multiple people to go into these meetings, we want a few of us to each just have one share.
Mm-hmm. Does that answer your question, Diana? Oh, I think you were closing. Okay. Benya.
Yes, hello.
Hi.
Hi. My name is Ben. I work for an organization in Guatemala called oeigt.org. We, our whole deal is we collect freedom of information data from the government, and we use it to help local communities basically, fight these mining projects. Now, I actually have a question that has to do with, these new digital AGMs. Like, for example, it was maybe a week ago, Bluestone Resources had their online AGM, and they talked about the Cerro Blanco project. Now, you don't even have to look hard to find like all the ways that they're breaking the law, right? I mean, it's blatant, it's open, it's government documented. Like the guy that approved the project then went to work for the company, and now he's on the run from the law. And you have, so all of these like things, like it's not even like on the human rights level of problems, it's like on the administrative, legal, local problem here. And so you go to this AGM, and I understand that, you can collect data there, you can get information from them because you see their narrative, what their plans are. But how do I get all this obvious law breaking to the shareholders, or in any way make that useful in this like post-pandemic digital age where also corruption is just the norm, especially in a place like Guatemala?
I mean, I would say that if you have like explosive, like evidence like that, going to a shareholder and asking a question that's really a statement is, a great way of doing that. And I do think that sometimes, the most deadpan kind of, questions that I've asked have been some of the most effective, in terms of like when Kate was sharing her story of, asking questions that don't, call her out as an activist, but could have come from an investor that is concerned about law breaking and things like that. So, and then Diana, I just wanted to say that we love it when people have shares in these companies. So if you do get shares in any companies, let us know, and we'll let you know if we need them for like impacted communities to go in. And then just to say something to Rachel, when people weren't allowed to speak at the AGM for Barrick, they did have shares, but they just weren't like the beneficial ones, or I forget, Rachel knows
the streeters.
But they were a different kind. So.
Yeah. Could I just respond to Benja a bit too?
Yeah.
I think annual meetings are a great chance, as I was mentioning, for media. And so I think press releases at the time of annual meetings is one of the few times you can get some of these media to pay attention. And Catherine or somebody else can tell me, there's also, you have to pay for it, but there is a way to get press releases into all of the mining publications and so on. I forget what it's called, but there is a way in Canada to get your press releases out. Maybe someone else could speak to that. There's a service.
I would also add, if that's okay, just what I wrote in the chat was Security Commission's complaints. So you can complain to the Ontario or BC Securities Commission, depending where the company is headquartered. They're very limited. Like, it's basically, you kind of have to just be speaking to the fact that they are not disclosing this risk to shareholders, which is like one of the kind of cardinal sins that a mining company can do. They're not beholden to any of the impacted communities in any real way, but they are beholden to shareholders. So that is like kind of one strategic point of intervention that might be useful for y'all to look into.
If I can just say one thing, like another key opportunity, and this sucks because it's out of our control, but is at a point where shareholders are already really pissed at the company. Some, like all of a sudden, they're suddenly interested in hearing all these other critiques as well. Yeah. So they might be pissed because of like ridiculous executive compensation package while their share price is declining. Why is the CEO getting all this money or whatever? But at a moment where they're concerned, suddenly there's appetite for business reporting and for shareholders also listening to like, oh, what are the other secret issues I don't know about this company? And Saku, didn't you put out a report about Barrick that then like thousands of investors downloaded?
I put out a report and it was mentioned and linked in the Globe and Mail, which is great. You know, you can't pay for that kind of coverage. And it was called Debunking Barrick, and it was just all about questioning their PR and then spinning it and seeing what's behind it and how they're cleverly trying to hide the abuses of the company. But yeah, Ben, if you want stuff to be read off, you know, like get in contact. If they're in Toronto, contact MISN. If they're in Vancouver, contact Mining Justice Alliance, and we can get you in touch with them as well. But if you give enough notice, then we can ensure that someone can get in and read a statement, you know, at the very least. That's usually what we can do. And it can be very effective. Like if it's explosive and they're not disclosing, you know, the investors do want to hear that. Anything that could possibly result in fines or especially a cancellation. Barrick Gold was sued by their own investors because they had to take a $5 billion, it ended up being like more like an $8 billion write-off for their Pascua-Lama project. But they were reporting a rosy relationship at Pascua-Lama almost the entire time. So,
yeah, Karen.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, in like one of the speakers that wasn't able to make it tonight was going to speak to an intervention that we did a long time ago in 2012, but that involved using a bunch of proxies. So folks, you know, allies and friends, like Saku mentioned, who have shares and who were able to put it in our name. And so we went inside of the meeting and we took over the mics, and it was an opportunity for during question period to share the results from this international health tribunal that Susanna Kashach and others, she's a MISN member and founder, had carried out in Guatemala related to the San Miguel Ixtahuacan and Goldcor's case. And so it was after we had taken over the mics and sort of shared some of the findings from the health tribunal, which, you know, Goldcorp was not sharing in terms of water contamination, environmental destruction, issues with the tailings pond. There were many shareholders were annoyed with us who were in the room. But there were also people who came up and asked questions afterwards and were like, oh, could you share more of this information? And so it was an opportunity to, you know, hand over the documents and yeah, there's value in that for sure.
Mm-hmm. Thanks everybody for kind of collectively answering that. I just want to seeing the time, and so just to kind of wrap up, just to reiterate what a number of people have said, that yes, absolutely, if you're thinking about doing this kind of stuff in your organizing, please do reach out to MISN, whether we can support with information or support with, you know, feet on the ground or whatever that looks like. We'd love to do that. But yeah, I also just want to kind of validate the concern that Ben, you were expressing about what it means to that all of these AGMs have now gone online, and the much more kind of narrowing opportunity to engage. And it's frustrating, and I don't actually know that we have full answer about like what to do instead, because we're kind of encountering this barrier alongside everybody else. And it's easy to, we can hope that they'll go back in person again so that we can reclaim some of our tactics, but we can also see this as an opportunity, right? Not to lean too hard on the same old thing over and over and over again. If we can predict anything from the mining industry, like so many other industries, is that they're slippery, that they are ever changing, and we have to respond with the same kind of nimbleness and collaboration and creativity to kind of never get left behind as they continue to change. So don't have all the answers yet, but we're very, very grateful that all of you joined us tonight to kind of think this through together. Hopefully you got some new ideas, and please stay in touch. Hopefully we can see each other in person again sometime soon. Have a great night, everybody. Thanks to all the storytellers. Much, much appreciated.